Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you can hear me. My name is Tortoise, and this is the Sensemaker Live Thinking that happens usually on a Friday lunchtime. This is where slow news meets fast news, old news meets new news. It's called the Sensemaker Live Thinking because it's brought to you by me and my colleague Claudia, who might wave. There she is. And we edit and write the daily Tortoise Sensemaker email. This thinking is also brought to you by Santander, one of our founding partners who've supported our journalism from the get-go, and we're very grateful for that. Today, as you all know, I hope, we're going to talk about travel, which was a heck of a subject before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hit. This time last week, I devoted the whole of the top of my Friday Sensemaker email to a long Twitter thread posted by a photographer called Laurel Chaw. I didn't know before, but the thread was very interesting, and it was about her battle through Hong Kong airport. And I'm hoping that one of the people who's joining us today can give her own version of that struggle, which I think is a really good insight into the future of travel in the age of coronavirus. We've also got some other great guests, and I will introduce them in due course. Since last week, in fact, just today, we've had a 25-page document published by the EU, which I think the UK will align itself closely with, which basically says that the future of air travel, this is in practical terms, looks like this: face masks for everybody, temperature checks, a whole new respiratory etiquette, and quite probably no duty free. But according to the Daily Mail, at any rate, this could make summer holidays possible. We'll get to that in a second. First, as many of you know, if you've been to a think-in before, a think-in is a join-in affair. So it's based on a newspaper editorial conference. The idea is that everybody joins in, everybody who wants to be heard gets heard. We have a loosely enforced no questions rule. I always rush through that bit because it's quite a clever rule. More people get to speak as a result of it, but it doesn't mean don't raise your hand. It means raise your hand and say what's on your mind. You just don't have to couch it as a question. Very briefly, to make sure that you're all concentrating, as you know, at the bottom of your screen, you have a participants list and a chat tab. And if you don't want to speak, but you want to say something, or you do want to, and you want to draw attention to it, to your point of view, type away in the chat function, which Claudia will be monitoring closely, and I will be asking Claudia what I'm missing. And also, if you tap on the participants list, bottom right-hand corner of your screen, a little gray tab says raise hand. So just to check that you're concentrating, would you, oh, hi, Barney. Nice to see you there. It's great, the list, isn't it? It reveals everything, everyone with their real names. Would you please raise your hand if you have flown in a plane since the start of lockdown, whatever country you're in? Really? Ellie? So that's like one person. Katie, we're going to come to you, not right now, but that's interesting. Who thinks, again, raise your hand. Francesca also marks herself out as someone who's been in a plane. Who thinks they're going to have an overseas summer holiday this year? Tanya, great, good for you. Okay, about half a dozen from about 100 on the call. Okay, who, and I suspect we might have more people raising their hands here, but far be it from me to prejudge this. Who has been looking at the steps being taken by the travel industry to adapt to this pandemic and has been thinking, that's it, I'm not flying anymore unless there are particular circumstances. I'm done with flying. Has anybody thought along those lines? And okay, so it's only a very small number. Those of that small number for whom environmental considerations are also important, take your hands down, and then we'll be left with the number who are only choosing not to fly because of the coronavirus. Ian and Lindsay. Interesting. I detect that we've got a fairly keen bunch of travelers here. Right. So as I mentioned, we've got some great guests who, and I want to make time for them and everybody else. So forgive me if I try to keep things moving along quite quickly. But first, if possible, I wanted to come to Julie Wright, also known as Jules to her friends. Hi. Now, what time zone are you in now? Can we make sure Jules is unmuted?
Right now I'm in Hong Kong, so it's just past 8 in the evening.
Right, great. And as I understand it, you quite recently, you live there and quite recently returned there. And as I was mentioning earlier, I'd read this fairly detailed account of what it now takes to enter Hong Kong. Can you just talk us through how it was and how it differs from the previous time you did it?
Yeah, of course. And thanks for inviting me to join this chat.
Pleasure.
So we are Hong Kong based as a family. We flew to the United States at the beginning of the outbreak, thinking that was the better place to be. And as things opened back up, we decided to come back to Hong Kong. So we had to fly from New York State, which is where our house is. And normally we came into Canada, normally we'd go out of Canada, but the border shut. So we had to go from New York State to Chicago, Chicago to LA, LA through to Hong Kong. So it was a long journey. Right. Indeed.
And on arrival in Hong Kong airport, what did they ask of you as passengers? How did they, what was new?
We had to fill out a health form before landing. You could do it online. And if you did your research, that kind of saved a bit of time. And we had to do a kind of a health form, and we have Hong Kong ID. So we had to put all of our information down there. And then upon arrival, we as a family had to get wristbands on. I think you can see that. Uh-huh. So we had to line up, and everyone had to give a contact number so that the government could contact you to make sure that you were quarantining properly. We have this quarantine wristband, which is a little bit more advanced than they were doing probably even about a month ago. And it's got kind of a tracking device. And then as you moved through that, everything was very swift. It was a really, really well kind of oiled machine at this point and very efficient. So we moved through there. That was probably only about a 45-minute process. And then we went through immigration as you normally would. And then from there, they bussed you to a center where you had to do a test for COVID-19. And that was a bit of a process, and you had to watch a video and then go do your test. And from there, you then went into a waiting center where you had to wait between 7 and 10 hours for your test results to come back. And then we were able to go home.
Blimey. And you waited how long? 10 hours?
So we waited, actually, I think we were on the lucky side. We waited about 7.5, and then they very slowly began calling your number. You had a lanyard with a number on it. They would call your number, and you'd go up and find your test results, and then you'd be on your way.
Okay. So how full was your plane from Chicago to, the longest leg?
Right, so LA to Chicago. LA to Hong Kong.
How full was it?
Full. It was very crowded.
Blimey.
Yeah.
Were you required to wear masks?
Yes.
And these wristbands that you have, what do they do? You are in quarantine right now, is that right?
Correct.
Which means what? You're essentially under self-imposed house arrest, or?
Well, it's self-imposed. However, if we do go outside the parameters of our home, we could face fines, we could face arrest. So what you would do is when you got home, you had to log into a Stay Home Safe app. And that app would then, you'd say, here we are, we're home. The app would then give you 60 seconds to essentially run around the parameter of your home. So if you had outdoor space, you could include that in your quarantine zone. And for most people, it seems like it didn't give them enough time, but they kind of said, okay, successful. So they sort of have a sense of where your zone is, and you are not to leave your zone for 2 weeks.
Is there anything to prevent you taking that off and just leaving home?
No. People are doing it, and there are stories of people doing it, but I think the fact is that in Hong Kong, people are very supportive of those of us who are in quarantine. There are so many offers for help and aid should we need anything, and it's a responsibility issue. And I think a lot of people look at it that way.
It's just amazing. And last question, because I'm fascinated with the details of this. In that long waiting period, what did they give you to do, /eat, /drink,
Absolutely nothing. So you sort of, it was a big room, no sunlight. Obviously there were facilities in terms of just bathrooms. There was no sort of water. And I was in a quarantine Facebook group that really helped out in terms of bringing food, bringing water, and checklists of things to do, because essentially you're brought into this room, you're sitting at a fold-out table with a fold-out plastic chair individually. So we were a family of 4, each one of us had our own table, and you couldn't group them together. And you're sat at this table for the duration. You could have a computer, you could take things from your luggage. Your large bags were all put in one section, but you were able to take a carry-on or a backpack. There were people with small children who had a pop-up tent. They had mats to lay their children down on, to have a nap or relax. But essentially it was sort of read, watch something, draw, and that's it. And they provided you with a sandwich and a water, and then later on some biscuits and some more water.
And was there anything offered by any official about how long they thought this system would be in place?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think that the assumption is that it's in place until there are 0 cases for a particular period of time, but I don't know what that time frame is.
But they didn't actually say anything like, we're sorry, but we're going to have to do this until there's a vaccine or something like that.
No, I think they don't want people to kind of have that date in mind, because that's ever changing, like this whole situation is.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing the details of that with us. I want, if possible, to come now to Andrew Charlton, who's an aviation consultant. And Andrew, are you with us? Hi. You're in Switzerland, is that right?
I am indeed.
Thank you so much. You were also a chief legal officer in a former life for Qantas, is that right?
Yes, yeah, guilty, Your Honour.
Okay. So I confess that one of the reasons I made contact was because I had read you quoted, I think it was in the Telegraph, and I speak here as a not so closeted plane spotter and aviation buff. You were quoted as saying that I won't see a Boeing 747 flying again. And I thought, well, if that's true, then this industry is in for a real seismic change. Clearly, the sort of customer end of it that Julie's just described is already changing out of all recognition. But just give us your overview, if you can, as to where you think the aviation industry is going, given this sudden shock to the system. And if you can explain in the process why I'm not going to see a jumbo in the air again, that would be great.
Sorry about that. Well, you may see jumbos again, but they'll be at historic flypasts at air shows and stuff like that. But Giles, to be fair, that was already a process underway. What we have seen in the last 10 years, certainly 20 years, has been a move to smaller aeroplanes. And the A380, which was remains the biggest aeroplane, was never a commercial success. There aren't sufficient of them, there were never sufficient of them flying for them to be commercially successful. And there were only ever in the order of 200 of them flying around, and about 130 of those belong to Emirates. And the 747 is now being retired. All this has done, I'm not to down, please don't think I'm downplaying the seismicness of the seismic shock, but what all this did for the large airframe was bring its retirement forward. Right. Qantas has now retired the last of its 747s, but it had already started that process. KLM has done the same. Air France has done the same. A bunch of other airlines are doing that as well. But that's not new. It just was an opportunity to speed it up. Where there will be a seismic change for airframes, speaking here to the unreformed aircraft spotters in the audience, and I don't count myself amongst those, by the way. But where there is a seismic shock for airframes is I don't think the 777 will fly again, or certainly none of the current 777s, the 200 and the 300. There is
just for those who aren't, these are big planes, but relatively new.
Well, the 777 is about 20, 25 years old now. And if you were to ask me what are my 5 favourite aeroplanes, what are my 5 most important aeroplanes in aviation history, the 777 is well and truly on that list in top 3, top 4 sort of status. The 777 reshaped aviation, but it reshaped it. It meant that we got away from the need to do the classic hub and spoke that we had been doing. We got away from the need to fly everyone to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow to, well, in my case, Sydney, obviously, and then to my real home in Melbourne. But given that I live in Geneva, the Geneva, London, Sydney, Melbourne, those 2 end legs were done on small aeroplanes. The 777 meant all of a sudden it was possible to go Geneva, Dubai, Melbourne in one stop, which is a significantly better product. And that the 777 opened up ports like Copenhagen and Manchester and Geneva and small cities around, not just obviously around Europe, but clearly around Europe. So the seismic change, though, to come back to the point, I mean, I can talk airframes all day. The seismic change is that we will increasingly, I think, now move to smaller aeroplanes. I think the winning aeroplanes will be the A350 and the 787, and probably the 787 ahead of the A350, just because it's that little bit smaller and that little bit more efficient. It's only got 2 engines, of course. The A380 and the 747 and the A340 all had 4 engines. But the shock that's coming, that's the technology part of the answer, I guess. The shock that's coming...
Yeah, we're being teased, by the way. My colleague Tess is saying, time for Andrew and Giles to get a room. I could go on about airframes for a long time. But let me jump in, because I want to ask, before moving on to Brian Young, can you hazard a guess, moving from aeroplanes to airlines, which might go to the wall? I know that's sort of market moving speculation, but it's not overly dramatic to suggest that some big names are going to be history from this.
It's absolutely not. But I think, again, to come back to it, I hate to keep doing this. IATA, which is the lobby group for airlines, and for whom I also used to work, by the way, IATA has put out charts that show that even before the pandemic, there were only 30 profitable airlines in the world.
All right. 30
profitable airlines in the world. And so that airlines will go to the wall, I think, is inevitable. Obviously that's sad for at some levels, but what it actually means, I'm an optimist about that, to be frank. I think that what that means is we can maybe get to a place where the industry finally reforms itself and finally becomes a modern international industry. We like to kid ourselves that aviation is an international industry and that airlines are international companies. They're not. They're national companies that just occasionally fly to other countries. And the problem with aviation, as a general comment, is that you're largely at the liberty or at the mercy of your dumbest competitor, because it's very, very easy in aviation to price your ticket at a marginal rate instead of at a fully costed rate. And once one airline starts to price a ticket at a marginal rate, the other airlines really have to match it, because we've spent the last 50 years explaining to people and educating people that cheap is better. and we all want cheap tickets. So everyone rushes to the cheaper tickets. The only place where we've finally broken away from that treadmill, if that's the right word, from that vicious circle, is in the United States, interestingly, again, before the pandemic. This is all pre-pandemic speak. And because the situation there was that the top 4 airlines carried more than 90% of all of the traffic. In Europe, by way of comparison, the top 12 airlines carry just a touch over 50% of the traffic. So there's significantly more airlines in the mix. And I don't think anyone thinks that aviation in America wasn't uncompetitive, although of course I do accept the point that the Americans did a marvellous, just an incredible trick. They managed to convince passengers that they should fly in complete misery. And that's bizarre, but people did it.
Yeah, and it's caught on over here.
Sorry?
It's caught on over here.
Yeah, sadly. Well, Mr. O'Leary has taught us that miserablism is a good thing because it's cheap. But I don't think that his model for doing this going forward is going to be sustainable, partially because there will be a requirement for significantly more cleaning of aeroplanes every time they land and turn around and so on. There will be some requirement for social distancing, or at least social respect. I think the days of being jammed in cheek by jowl are perhaps over, or coming close to over. The economic model will change. That said, for Mr. O'Leary, that's not the end of the world, because I think, as you rightly said, Giles, early, to finally bring this back to the point of the question, a lot of airlines are likely to go to the wall. It won't happen until, I think, the winter after the travel restrictions are lifted. But come the winter after the travel restrictions are lifted, I think a lot of airlines will collapse.
Thank you very much for that gloomy prognosis.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Especially if it means that we're all going to ultimately have to pay more. But then, of course, there are environmental reasons why perhaps we should have been braced for that anyway.
I think we need to be careful, though. A healthy aviation industry isn't an aviation industry that's got lots of cheap tickets. I think a healthy aviation industry is an industry that's got profitable airlines, profitable airports, profitable air traffic control agencies, safety costs, complexity costs, the environment costs. I think we have to accept that maybe we were living on air there for a while with very cheap tickets.
Yeah, no, good point. Good point. So just to show the system works, I want to come to Dom Tyler, who's had his hand up, and then, as I mentioned, we'll go to Brian Young. Dom, hi.
I thought Andrew's points there were really interesting, and I just wanted to sort of put an alternative perspective in. That I think if you look at the airlines that are likely to be bailed out by governments, I'd argue that they're overwhelmingly going to be national carriers, your Air France, your British Airways. And these airlines own most of the, the older, larger airframes, and they try to keep these planes flying for longer. That's my understanding of it. So is it possible that the death of the hub and spoke model might be slowed down by the COVID-19 crisis, as these airlines actually are able to survive better, as opposed to the really tight margin, low cost carriers who can't afford to send a plane half empty between two destinations? They have to completely fill the aircraft. I guess also with the cleaning point, with the hub and spoke model, your aircraft are spending longer on the ground, which again, just the natural, the system itself supports additional cleaning and so on.
Okay, it's a question, but I'll allow it. I can't hear you, Andrew.
Here we go. Now I've been unmuted. Yes. Excellent points, Dom. And frankly, if you'll look away for a moment, I'll just quickly steal some of what you're thinking there, because I think it's very good. The reason why I think many of the national carriers, soi-disant national carriers, your Alitalias, your Air Frances, your Tarom from Romania, for example, TAP Portugal, those sorts of airlines have been renationalised by their governments. They were nationals, of course, then privatised, or in Alitalia's case, over and over and over. And you're right, the hub and spoke model will be beneficial from, it is slower, but the carriers themselves, I think, have a business model that's already been proved to not work. The one thing that sustains that model, unfortunately, is the regulatory framework for aviation, which dates back from 1944. The war wasn't even over. And the regulatory framework is a complete anachronism, and is unfortunately allowing some of those national carriers to carry on. But I think what will happen is, because they were nationalised, when we get to the first time airlines need credit or need cash again, which is to say when the summer's over, what will happen? Here's what I think will happen. The bans will be lifted either piecemeal or whatever, regionally, whatever. The airlines will be so desperate to attract passengers to get over that fear of flying stuff that's out there, to encourage people to travel, to get over, realising you can do half your meetings by Zoom and you don't need to go to every meeting and all that sort of stuff. They will put cheap tickets onto the market. There will be an outbreak of seat sales. I think you can guarantee that. That will generate a lot of cash, but it won't be profitable cash. Come the winter, when traditionally traffic goes down anyway, they're going to be stuck with no cash. And by the time they get through the end of the winter, their shareholders, which are now the national governments, of course, are going to realise that there might be some other more important things that they should be spending their money on. Things like, say, I don't know, public health, education, stuff like that, maybe. And so I think that by then they will be in really dire straits and be unable to go back to the market. And their business model, I think, has already proved to be struggling, frankly. And then, of course, we can layer over that again the whole environmental argument. If your model, let's KLM just for example, I read a report recently of two people who went to a conference in New York. One was based in Paris, and it was much cheaper for him to fly on KLM up over Amsterdam and then to New York. And the other was from Amsterdam. It was much cheaper for him to fly down to Paris and then across to New York. I think those sorts of environmentally hopelessly inefficient things will come under the microscope again. So I think a lot of the hubbing and spoking model, which often calls for backhauling, is going to be in trouble.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to move things along because I want the conversation to be about not just about aviation, but about travel as a way of life and as a choice that we make. We've got a wonderful travel writer, Sophie Roberts, in the room. But first, and Claudia, I'm conscious that I have not been paying as much attention as I should have been to the chat. So please dive in. Particularly, a lot of people seem to be worried about the environmental cost of travel, and we must make sure we come to that. But first, Brian, you are Managing Director for Europe, Middle East, and EMEA for G Adventures, right? And our very own Michelle and her husband brought us to you. So thank you very much for being with us. G Adventures, as I understand it, is one of the world's biggest adventure companies. How are you surviving now, given this whole new fear of flying, given that most of your product range, as I understand it, depends on some international travel?
Yeah, thank you for the invite. Nice to see so many people on the call. So our key thing has been, at the moment, first and foremost, was to get as many of our customers back as quickly as possible and safely as possible. And in the current environment, our focus has been around looking at our product and program in terms of when do we think, we're going to hit the bottom of this pandemic, and when do we actually start to see things start to open up. Mm-hmm. So our whole focus at the moment is around that planning phase of what's that going to look like? One of the key things that we're seeing for our business at this minute in time is a lot of bookings into next year. So there's clearly confidence in people wanting to travel. I think, as human beings, we're born explorers. So I think whilst people are in lockdown, what we're seeing is from the initial sort of impact of COVID, people going into lockdown, furlough schemes, placing people into a furlough scheme. I think what's given people is time to reflect. And what we've seen over the weeks is, as that time's gone on, the searches that we're seeing through our website have increased dramatically. So clearly people have started, what I call wanderlust, started to think about, when we get out of this lockdown, what's it going to look like? And people want to go traveling. So therefore we can see that in the bookings that we're currently getting for next year. And I think the key bit for us is come back to the first instance is flight safety, people's confidence to get back on a flight. And we know the airlines are doing a lot of work, as Andrew's already alluded to, and likewise, the airports and such like. And it's interesting, only a few weeks ago on the BBC, they're reporting, a flight from Dublin into Heathrow, if I think it was Aer Lingus, was packed. And that was only a few weeks ago. So clearly people, even whilst in lockdown with the pandemic, were willing to get on a plane, even though maybe that duration of the flight was only an hour. So I think for us, it's a case of, as we see, things start to open up, whether that's air bridges, so into Europe as such, like maybe in the first instance, and then we see the rest of the world as borders open and then understand what those restrictions will be. I think you'll start to see confidence. People will want to get traveling again.
Are there any, Brian, sorry, are there any particular countries that people are booking thinking that they're safer than others?
So I think what we're seeing is customers looking further out and saying, you know what, and actually in about a year's time, the belief will be either, the pandemic will be under control, there may well be a vaccine, so they've got confidence to look that far forward. And one of the trends that we're seeing is actually two facets. Is we're seeing a longer duration in terms of some of the bookings that were coming through. So we think people, because of the length of time they may be in lockdown, are looking to explore a destination for much longer rather than in and out, maybe city break or a 14-night holiday. And the other interesting thing that we're seeing is our active program, which includes trips like trekking tours into Peru, it's climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, Everest Base Camp. The searches for those tours is really high. And what I think is happening there is a lot of people are taking time to reflect and have had that on their list of once in a lifetime things to do. And I think the pandemic has maybe made those guys think, actually, when we get out of this pandemic, this once in a lifetime trip that we've talked about for a number of times, you know what, actually, let's go and do that when the time is right. So that's been a really interesting part of the trends that we're seeing with our customers.
That's really interesting. One more question. And by the way, I'd really be interested to hear about anybody's once in a lifetime trips, whether they're planning, dreaming, booking. But Brian, are any of your customers, are any of your trips, do they have quarantine built in?
So that's a key thing that we're looking at the moment. I think one of the advantages that we have as a business is that we're a small group tour company. So on average, there's only 12 people normally on our trips. So I think that's a very different dynamic to maybe a larger tour company or a cruise ship where you've got, high propensity people, whilst on holiday. And the other facet is that, we use small hotels around the world. And likewise, the transportation, obviously, given the size of the group, is much smaller. And so we're looking at all of those facets, how we work with our supply chain to ensure that moving forward, there's elevated health and hygiene based around social distancing, to protect our customers whilst on holiday. And I think the fact that we also offer things like local living homestays where you're sort of off the beaten track, you're sort of in a cocoon in that respect. I think those type holidays are going to be popular for us. We have a sailing program where a whole family could take, the boat totally to themselves and take, a holiday on that vessel for a week. So I think the key bit for us is just making sure that moving forward, we work with that supply chain to ensure that we put all the necessary items in play for the duration of that tour that gives our customers total confidence around safety aspects of their holiday.
Well, good luck. I hope that it is possible to sustain the business through these tough times. Speaking of the off the beaten track, Sophie Roberts is an expert in that. And Imi, we've come to Sophie. Alison, I see your hand up. We'll come to you in a second. Sophie, you have been all over Siberia, written the wonderful The Lost Pianos of Siberia. I commend it to everybody. I commend Siberia to everybody as well. Do you think that wonderful, old-fashioned, if you like, totally independent roaming of the planet is going to revive, or might it possibly be somewhat immune to the pressures of the pandemic because it involves a more solitary activity?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the core of it is what's happened with this COVID pandemic is that we have, as consumers, been exposed to the possibility of risk in travel. and tour operating and travel agenting and all the rest of it was all about giving the consumer the sense of risk management in that trip they were taking. And that sense has been heavily eroded by what has actually occurred. Numerous friends, numerous readers have been in touch with me since this has begun, unable to get refunds, because when you dive into the small print of travel companies and all the rest of it, you start to see that you're not covered as you thought you might have been in exceptional circumstances. I have always been a pretty independent traveler. I book the flights, I book the trips. I often have to rely upon tour operating businesses and also including the expertise of a small group tour like your company. Brian, that we're just talking about now. Was it Brian? Forgive me.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, what we've now seen is that we've got to look after ourselves as we travel. And that changes, I think, the future of travel for those who are passionate about it, because you've got to work it out. You've got to work out your scale of risk versus return. And for me, it's a different scale to somebody that just wants a summer holiday around a shared pool in the Mediterranean. There's so many nuances to this. The last assignment I did was in Chad, in an area that is a red zone on the map before COVID, long before COVID. Now we're in a complete British Commonwealth Office red zone and we can go nowhere. But it was a personal decision on risk, and no one was going to look after my back whether I was there or not. And I think that's what this kind of post-COVID travel is going to be. The other thing I think is really interesting to raise here is we've talked a lot about the how and when we might return to travel. I think that this whole period has given question to the why. Why do we want to travel? What is it we are after? What is the return that we seek? And that varies hugely by nationalities, by individuals. The way that China travels, and China is a huge market, vast. They travel very quickly for very short periods of time. You see them go into that market, go into the Maldives, or the Korean market, go into Bali. It's for 3-night honeymoons to get a picture by an infinity pool. That is so different from the way that a European might travel and might re-engage with the act of travel, going for these much longer periods of time. The Brits are very different from the Americans. The Americans don't get the same holiday time like we do. So when they go to Africa on safari, they go one night, changing their lodges. I just don't think these questions are gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you talk about seismic, I think it's absolutely huge. And we're just at the front end of it, talking about with airlines. The lodges are suffering, like, some of them are hanging onto a shoestring, because, like the comment made earlier, that there's only 30 profitable airlines in the world, you can be pretty sure that some of these really special lodges in Africa, conservation tourism, they are on a knife edge right now. So I think you're going to see a lot. I think you're going to see a lot disappear. To be
Sophie, you made the very good point that this is everybody's now having to factor risk into travel, even if it was something that they essentially outsourced to tour operators before. Do you think ultimately that might be a good thing? Do you think that sort of reality check might end up exposing more people to the very particular joys and insights that come from minding your own back, looking after yourself?
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people say that is the great thing about travel, and almost what redeems it in an age when we're all rightly worried about our carbon footprint, is that the more people who travel widely, the more people know about the rest of the world and cease regarding foreign as other, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe from the bottom of my heart that travel is an act of empathy, not just consumption. And I think that core is, which belongs to us all as human beings, has been lost as the industry has dominated our approach to travel. We've become less adventuresome. We've cozied ourselves up in air-conditioned boxes. We've removed ourselves in sort of what I call rich man's prisons, you know, these kind of super uber luxury resorts where the rest of the world in reality is fenced out. I think and I hope that as we move into a new phase that we will rediscover empathy, which is such an important part of, as you say, breaking down borders, of mutual understanding, of difference, and all the rest of it. Whether or not it will happen, I don't know. But we have every single one of us in recent weeks been exposed to our own mortality, and that's real. And that's real in every single country right now. So maybe marketing will lose out to the reality of feet on the ground and that contact again. It's what I want for my children, for sure.
Great, thank you. Can we go to Alison and then Claudia? I'm going to come to you for highlights from the chat, but also I know you've been talking to some interesting people. But first, Alison, you've been very patient. I think you're still muted. There you go. I can't hear you.
Right. How's that? Better?
Good. Good.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm so pleased that this is happening. It's a giant subject you've embarked on for an hour, actually.
Well, we were going to try and do bikes and public transport as well. So.
Well, I became interested in the impact of tourism way back in the late 80s and started a campaigning organisation called Tourism Concern, which became a national campaigning charity, folded quite recently, really for some of the reasons that Sophie has been outlining about the mushrooming of the industry. Now, the reason I started the organisation amongst another group of people who were already looking at what was happening to tourism and travel in the 80s, this is the 80s, was because tourism's a two-way street. And even in this conversation, we're forgetting, you know, yeah, we're travelers, but it's the hosts that also create the holiday experience. And I'm really concerned that already that is at a point when there should be more empathy around, as Sophie said, and I think a lot of what Sophie said is great. It's not being thought about. Now, Brian was talking about, you know, that there is, I've listened to two big travel kind of webinars this week, trying to mull this over within the industry. And they're all saying, oh, people are going to want open spaces. Problem with that is, again, it's consumer, it starts with consumer, and open spaces are not empty spaces, really. Why can we, how are we ever going to get people to consult? I'd love to know whether Brian, for example, in thinking about, oh, this is where people are wanting to go, where are his conversations at the other end? I suspect in a company like his, they're there, but it's not happening. I'd better shut up for a minute, but I think this is a conversation that needs to go and come back on Tortoise in different ways, actually, because tourism affects all our lives now, even more so than it did all those years ago when we were worried about it.
Well, Brian, would you like to come back on that? What sort of conversations are you having with the people, the hosts, the people at the other end?
So we have two facets to our business. You know, there's the touring element of what we do, which is the pure, you know, holiday side of the business, but we're also a social enterprise. So we have projects all over the world. We're just close to 100 projects that are all about how we give back to local communities. And they're really important facets to what we do as a business and really important to us. So those projects, as you can imagine, are suffering without tourism at this moment. So Planetera is the foundation that sets up these projects with G Adventures, through which our travellers all pass through. So we've been working quite closely with those projects over the last X amount of weeks to understand what is the need for those projects, where are those that are most in need of our help and our customers' support to help those projects as well. So we've been out like a rallying cry to all of our passengers to try and raise funds so that we can divert funds in the right way and to the right projects that are most in need in these local communities. And funny enough, talk about climbing Kilimanjaro, but there were a number of us from the travel industry that climbed back in November to raise money initially to create more projects around the world. But what we've come to the consensus of is, because of the impact of the current coronavirus, is the money that we've raised, and literally last night, funny enough, we had a conference call with those guys, is that we're now, instead of creating a new project, the funds that we've raised, we're dispersing amongst those community projects that we support where they're in most need. So we've got a lot of things that we're trying to do to support those local community projects that we have around the world. And at the same time, the owner of our organisation, Bruce, had a Zoom conference call just last night with, I think it's about 300 of our overseas suppliers. Because again, it's so important for us. They're key to what we do. You know, they're key in local communities through which we travel. So that was the opportunity for Bruce to, one, explain, you know, where we're at as an organisation, where we see the industry at the moment and how we sort of think things are going to, you know, come out and when and such like. And at the same time, for us to listen to, you know, our supply chain and understand, you know, some of the situation that they're in, and how we can support them moving forward. So I agree with everything that both Sophie and Alison have said. You know, tourism isn't just about people going on holiday. It's actually the big impact that people traveling can have on local communities in some of the most in need destinations.
Yeah, it's good to hear, Brian, that last bit about the call with your suppliers, because as Tess says in the chat, this isn't about charity, or certainly not just about charity. It's about really sustainable partnerships. So the social enterprise part of it is clearly great and laudable, but what we all want and need is the core business to be sustainable and mutually beneficial, and not exploitative wherever you find your open spaces end up. Claudia, I did say, what have we missed? I feel that but further up the chat, people were worried about environmental footprint of travel, but is that receded in the chat?
Yeah, so we were talking about environmental footprint early on. I think Martin, who's also got his hand up for a different point, made a really interesting point early on about how this isn't just about whether you will be able to fly. We have to consider the restrictions once you get somewhere. So the idea of just, you know, if you have to quarantine for 2 weeks, you can't just go on holiday for 10 days because, you know, either side, it's going to be a huge amount of time. And that kind of brought up another conversation about who will be able to travel. So if your job allows you to work from home, it's going to be a lot easier, presumably, for you to go on holiday for longer periods of time. I thought that was a really interesting point. And Pam made a great point about creative industries. I think maybe Louise also pointed out that there are some jobs which are heavily dependent on travel. So the ATP tennis tournament, for example, you know, the touring, all these different like offshoots of travel, which aren't just tourism, are going to be really heavily affected.
Yeah. Now, Claudia.
Yes. You
were talking to a pal of yours, right?
Yes.
Who does something intimately related to this. How's their life changed?
So I interviewed someone earlier who is a pilot, and she was talking about, well, obviously there's a very specific experience that she's having at the moment. She's based in the Middle East, and so compared to a lot of pilots, she's in quite a good position because although she's been forced to take paid leave, she is still flying a little bit. They have cargo planes that she's able to fly, and then when she does fly them, they have these like police escorts in a lot of places. So you're staying in these hotels with a police kind of presence outside to make sure you don't go anywhere. But compared to a lot of the industry, she feels all right because she's a significant number of years into her career and feels like actually at this stage it would cost the airline more to get rid of her and then rehire someone because so much money has gone into her training. Whereas she highlighted, I didn't really think about this, there's so many, it's so expensive to become a pilot. And she was talking about a couple of people that she knows who have just completed their training. And so what's happened to them is they've just completed their training, they were supposed to go into these jobs, those jobs have been completely cancelled, and they've been suddenly left in £150,000 worth of debt with a skill that they can't practice. It's essentially not transferable, and their future employment requires them to keep that training up. So I think there's a huge group of people who are, obviously that's a terrible situation to be in. Obviously they're also, you know, there are other considerations. I think she was saying that cabin crew are having a really terrible time because they're the first to go because the training is cheaper. So that's kind of the personal experience side of things. She mentioned a couple of things that I thought were really interesting about the future of travel. Her point mainly being that she thinks there's vulnerable people, depending on your age, you might have you know, just whatever vulnerabilities you have. Considering getting on a plane might be a much bigger deal now, because we're all more aware. No one ever really thought before, or maybe some people did, I didn't, about getting a cold or getting something on a plane. She thinks that will have an impact. She thinks that younger people with disposable incomes who are less likely to be affected by the virus might be the first ones to bounce back. But crucially, she said she thinks that business travel will be the area that doesn't bounce back, because that's what happened in 2008, where people, it's kind of already been mentioned, but you realize that why send someone across the world where we now have Zoom? You can do so much of this travel, this kind of, these meetings online. You don't need to be doing it by traveling. So she was just basically saying she thinks that the industry will come back, but it will be very different. And I think a lot of her friends who are pilots have had a similar realization that their industry is never going to be the same, and their jobs probably won't be the same.
That's fascinating, especially if it's true about business travel. That's really going to affect business models. But just Claudia, why the police escort? Are they worried about pilots doing a runner? What's that about?
They just to keep them in their hotels, I guess, in case, to stop the spread of the virus. Yeah.
Right. Now, Martin, Claudia did mention something you'd said in the chat, but you've still got your hand up. So there's obviously something burning a hole in your head. What is it?
Yeah, so actually it was something slightly separate to what Claudia mentioned, and that is about how I think a lot of the conversation today in the chat and on the screen, it's sounded like lots of middle class pursuits to me. And my real concern here is I think that we're going to see those in lower income employment, those in quite precarious employment, or even those with small families, in which young families, in which they would go off for 1 week in Spain or Greece and then come home again during the school holidays. They're not going to be able to undertake these kind of holidays anymore if the quarantines are still in place. So, like was already mentioned, if you're going to fly away for a week and then come back and spend 2 weeks in your house, that's not going to work for most people. And with that, are we going to see an increase in the cost of holidays in the UK, because the tourist industry in the UK has been hit so hard and is going to continue to be hit until we're fully out of lockdown? Are they going to raise the price of hotels and other such places in the UK that only really the more wealthy are going to be able to go, particularly those who don't feel comfortable going overseas? And so I'm thinking immediately, my parents, they're not going to fly overseas anytime soon. So they're going to look to holiday in the UK. So are we going to see people priced out, essentially? And it's going to be those that I think we've talked quite a lot about in all the various thinkings over the last couple of months. It's those in the lowest income, those who have got the less security. So can you realistically take this time off and still have a job to come back to? And I think we need to be talking about those people and about the opportunities for them to actually have a holiday, as opposed to go trekking around South America for 2 or 3 months.
Right, just any holiday. Yes. I'm not aware of our great proactive government turning its collective mind to that yet, but it clearly is a space for perhaps the third sector, which already does a fair amount of that for really disadvantaged people. Maybe that's a whole area of endeavor that they need to get into. But yeah, I mean, for the people that you describe, and I'm sorry if they're underrepresented on the call, we need to reach out. The network thinkings do a great job of reaching out. There's the cash element of that. There's also the narrowing of horizons, isn't there? I mean, it's sometimes been fashionable to be a bit sneery about mass, low-cost foreign travel. And heck, on Ryanair, it can be an ordeal getting to and from. But still, over the past generation, low-cost air travel has broadened horizons for millions and millions of people. And this wasn't actually the point you were making, but it's what it made me think of. It'd be a real shame if a whole generation missed out on seeing the world. I fully accept that it's environmentally unsustainable in some forms, but sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be in the same position. It was well into my teens before I actually went abroad myself. I remember I was doing my mum cutting the coupons out of the Sun for us to go to a caravan in Wales or something like that, and it didn't do me any harm. But I think we've travelled, excuse the pun, so far in terms of people being able to go overseas, regardless of income. To a certain extent. I know somebody in the chat's already said there's lots of people that don't have holidays, and that, you know, it's only going to get worse, but we'll be going backwards, and that's not a thing we should be doing. Yeah.
We're going to run out of time shortly, so let me come back to Andrew and Tess. I hope we'll have time to come to you too. Andrew.
Thanks, Giles. I'll be as quick as I can. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of those points about the cost of training and so forth. I think to simply not, or to not want to go forward and reshape and reform simply because we've spent a lot of money on training is really counterproductive. First of all, any pilot can take another job. Their jobs are very, very reskillable. Any job where you basically stare at a screen for 8 hours and occasionally push a button, you're set to be a pilot forever. But one of the problems is that, for example, in air traffic control, we spend upwards of €250,000 training each controller. What that means is we're stuck with a system of air traffic control where we control aeroplanes using VHF radio and radar, which are World War I technologies. I think this retraining cost argument is dreadfully disturbing for those that are currently in jobs, the poor loves, but it slows down reform. And yes, there will be a seismic change. It will impact tourism. It will impact travel generally, but not all of that is going to be bad. And I think that's one of the problems at the moment. It's a very middle-class problem, isn't it, to worry about how your job's going to be upset. But I actually think we could reform aviation to make it about 1,000 times better. But we're going to have to get rid of the current regulatory framework, which dates, as I said before, from 1944.
Thank you. That's amazing. I sit in front of a screen for 8 hours a day. Maybe I could be a pilot soon. That'd be great.
A pilot. It's frankly not very hard. I'm sorry to say this, but it's not very hard. All you've got to have is a very reassuring voice, Giles.
Tess, speaking of reassuring voices.
Oh, thank you, lovely. It's a really quick one. I just wanted to feed in a bit of sort of the generational shift as well, because I've got 16 and 17-year-old daughters who, you know, when I grew up, travel was a massive luxury, a huge excitement. You know, all I ever wanted to do was travel, and every opportunity I would. My daughters are the generation that thinks that discretionary travel, particularly by plane, is non-negotiable. So they refuse to fly now from an environmental perspective. And I think, you know, we're bringing together a few different big themes to create the perfect storm here. I mean, I'm with Sophie that, you know, my travellers help me understand the world and hopefully be a more empathetic and wide-ranging person, but I'm fighting a losing battle with my teenagers to get them to travel.
That's fascinating. And as Ellie points out in the chat, a lot of people don't have, and as Martin did just now, a lot of people don't have the option anyway. Well, look, it's 1:59. Thank you, everyone. I feel I've learned a lot and absorbed some new nuances about this whole field, which is the one that I started out in a lifetime ago. Before becoming a jobbing journalist, I wrote a little bit of travel myself, and so just to hear the word wanderlust, Brian, thank you so much. I really hope that it survives as a concept. This shock and the new fear of flying, which clearly some people have, and I do. the idea of sharing a pressurized aluminium tube with a virus that I have no idea how it's going to affect me if it's there does fill me with a certain sort of dread, and I'll try and be brave. I think it's fascinating, this idea that people are still booking and they're possibly using your company's website, Brian, to dream about once in a lifetime trips. And I hope that this time next year, they will become a genuine possibility. Sophie told us about the idea of travel as an act of empathy. And there's quite a stark contrast between that and the phrase that she used a second later, travel as an industry taking us to air-conditioned boxes and rich man's prisons. There are a lot of guilty secrets about travel, aren't there? Because I've enjoyed bivvy bags in forest in the middle of nowhere, but I confess also to a failing to rich man's prisons if someone's offering me one, especially on a press facility. But those days are long gone. Thank you all very much, Martin in particular, for reminding us, as I say, that a lot of people don't have the kind of middle class options that we've been in large part discussing, and Andrew for dialing in from Switzerland and indulging my fascination in airframes, Sophie, Brian, Julie for kicking it all off with a description of how you get through Hong Kong. Obviously, heck, bring a laptop, bring a book for that 10-hour wait. I hope that we're not all destined to have 10-hour waits in all airports. I hope that we can get some of these travel bubbles or tunnels or super highways between countries that trust each other's anti-COVID arrangements. But I hope also that it doesn't come down to that. And in a sense, all thinkings these days come back to the old one about vaccines, don't they? We hope we get one of them too. Anyway, to our guests, to everybody who's joined the call, thank you very much. It's a long weekend. Have a good one. I confess that we as a family are thinking of getting out of the house for the first time in 2 weeks, but I'm not going to tell you where, and I'm not going to tell you when, because I think anyway, it's going to be very, very crowded. But whatever you do, have a great weekend. Thank you, Claudia. And let's all wave and see you again soon. Thank you.